You haven't made any obvious mistakes. You haven't burned anything down. You haven't made the catastrophic decisions that ruin lives in the way films and cautionary tales describe. You've shown up. You've worked. You've tried to do the right things in the right order. And yet, something is off. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would necessarily notice. But you notice. The distance between the life you intended and the life you're actually living. The version of yourself you keep meaning to become, and the version that shows up every day instead. That gap isn't the result of bad luck. It isn't the result of the wrong circumstances, the wrong timing, the wrong people in your corner. It's the result of habits so ordinary, so reasonable looking, and so quietly woven into the fabric of daily life that you've never once stopped to identify them as the problem. That's what makes them destructive, not the damage they do in a single day, but the damage they accumulate silently across months and years, while you remain convinced that the problem is somewhere out there, waiting to be solved, when the whole time it has been in here. Marcus Aurelius understood this, not as a distant philosophical principle, but as something he confronted in himself, night after night, in the private pages of the Meditations. The habits that corrode a life aren't the dramatic ones. They're the quiet ones, the ones that look like reason, the ones that feel like wisdom, the ones you'd defend if someone challenged them. Those are the ones that cost you the most, and those are exactly what this is about. 10 habits, not 10 things to add to a self-improvement checklist, not 10 behaviors to feel guilty about and then quietly forget. A system, one that has been running in the background of your life, largely unexamined, producing results you've been attributing to everything except its actual source. That's what makes this different from the usual list. Each habit on this list feeds the next. The first makes the second more likely. The second makes the third harder to escape. By the time you reach the end, what you're looking at isn't 10 separate problems. It's one coherent pattern of self-sabotage, built from pieces that each looked reasonable on their own. The Stoics didn't treat destructive habits as personal failures. They treated them as philosophical errors, mistakes about what actually matters, what is actually in your control, and what a life is actually for. Marcus Aurelius returned to these errors in the Meditations, not because he had conquered them, but because they kept returning. Because that is the nature of habits. They don't disappear through understanding alone. They require something more sustained than insight. They require the daily work of seeing them clearly and choosing differently, one ordinary moment at a time. That daily work begins with being able to name what you're dealing with, which is what the next 40 minutes are for. These 10 habits don't announce themselves. They don't feel like destruction when they're happening. They feel like routine. They feel like personality. They feel, in some cases, like virtue. And that is precisely why they've been so difficult to see, and so costly to carry without knowing it. What they cost, what drives them, and what the Stoics identified as the way through. Let's start there. Habit 1. Mistaking busyness for progress. Of all the habits on this list, this one receives the most praise. Nobody tells you to slow down. Nobody questions the full calendar, the packed schedule, the back-to-back commitments that leave no space between one thing and the next. In fact, the opposite happens. The busier you appear, the more seriously you are taken. The more you have on, the more capable you seem. Busyness has become the primary currency of worth in modern life, and spending it freely feels like exactly the right thing to do. Which is why so few people ever stop to ask the question Marcus Aurelius kept returning to. Not, am I busy? But, am I moving in the right direction? Because those are not the same question. And confusing them is the first and most foundational way a life goes quietly off course. Motion is not the same as direction. Activity is not the same as progress. A person can be genuinely, exhaustingly, demonstrably busy, filling every hour, responding to every demand, staying on top of everything that lands in front of them, and be moving at remarkable speed, away from everything that actually matters to them. This is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of orientation. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this with a precision that is difficult to argue with. He observed that most people live as if they have unlimited time, as if the hours being spent on things of marginal importance are not the same hours that will never return, as if busyness itself were a form of progress rather than simply a form of motion. He was not describing laziness as the enemy of a good life. He was describing misdirected effort, the person who works hard and arrives somewhere they never intended to be. You probably know what this feels like. The end of a week that was genuinely full. Meetings attended, tasks completed, messages answered, obligations met, that nevertheless produced a quiet, uncomfortable sense that nothing important moved. That the things you actually care about, the work that requires your full attention, the relationships that require your real presence, the goals that require sustained, deliberate effort, were once again deferred in favor of everything that was urgent. Urgent and important are not the same thing either. The Stoics made this distinction not as a productivity framework, but as a philosophical one. Your time is finite. Not abstractly finite, specifically, concretely, measurably finite. Every hour given to busyness for its own sake is an hour not given to something else. And the accumulation of those hours, across a year, across a decade, is what produces the gap. The distance between the life you intended and the one you actually built. Busyness is not the enemy of the good life because it is exhausting. It is the enemy of the good life because it is invisible, because it produces the feeling of progress without the substance of it, because it gives you something to point to, the full calendar, the completed list, the sense of having shown up, while the deeper questions go unasked. What am I building? What does this add up to? Is the direction I'm moving actually the direction I chose? Those questions require stillness to answer. And busyness, by design, leaves no room for stillness. Marcus Aurelius built stillness into his days deliberately, not as rest, as examination, as the daily practice of checking whether his effort was going where it actually needed to go. That practice is not a luxury. For the Stoics, it was a discipline as essential as any other. The habit of busyness doesn't ask you to do less. It asks you to look up, long enough to check whether the direction is right. Because motion without direction isn't productivity, it's just movement. And movement, sustained long enough in the wrong direction, is the quietest way a life gets lost. Habit 2. Seeking approval without realizing it. This one is harder to see than the last. Busyness at least has the decency to be visible. You can look at a calendar and recognize it. You can feel the exhaustion it produces. But approval seeking doesn't show up on a calendar. It shows up in the decisions you make, quietly, automatically, in the space between what you actually want and what you believe will be received well. And the reason it's so difficult to catch is that it doesn't feel like seeking approval. It feels like being considerate. It feels like being professional. It feels like being the kind of person who takes others into account, who thinks before speaking, who reads the room, who adjusts accordingly. These are not small virtues. In reasonable measure, they are genuinely valuable. But there is a point at which consideration for others stops being a virtue and becomes something else entirely. The point at which their opinion of you starts making your decisions for you. And Epictetus identified this as one of the most fundamental threats to a free life. Not external imprisonment, internal imprisonment. The man who needs the approval of others, he observed, has handed the keys to his own freedom to strangers. People who don't know his full situation. People who are navigating their own unresolved patterns. People whose approval he has never consciously chosen to seek, but whose disapproval he has been unconsciously working to avoid for most of his adult life. Think about the last decision you made that was shaped by how it would look. Not a dramatic decision, a small one. The opinion you didn't share because the room didn't seem receptive. The direction you didn't pursue because the people around you didn't understand it. The version of yourself you dialed down in a context where you suspected it wouldn't land well. None of these moments felt like surrender. They felt like social intelligence. They felt like knowing when to hold back. But added together over time, they form something. A life that has been quietly edited, not by your own judgment, but by your ongoing calculation of what the people around you can accept. A version of yourself that has been adjusted, layer by layer, in the direction of approval, until the distance between who you actually are and who you present yourself to be has become wide enough to produce a persistent, low-grade sense that something is missing. That something is authorship. The sense that the life you're living is genuinely yours, chosen from the inside, directed by your own values, and shaped by your own judgment rather than by the accumulated preferences of everyone whose opinion you've been quietly managing. Marcus Aurelius returned to this in the Meditations with a directness that is almost confronting. He wrote about the man who looks outward for validation, who needs the world to confirm his worth before he can act with confidence. And he named it clearly, not as understandable, not as human, but as a confusion. A mistake about where worth actually lives and where it has always lived. Worth is not located in the opinions of others. It never was. The approval you've been seeking was never going to provide what you were looking for from it, because what you were looking for from it was the sense that you are enough. And that sense cannot be installed from the outside. It can only be built from the inside through the daily practice of acting in alignment with your own values, regardless of how that action is received. That is not indifference to others. That is the difference between consideration and dependence, between caring what people think and needing what people think, between adjusting your delivery and surrendering your direction. The Stoics were clear about which one was worth pursuing, and the habit of approval-seeking, unexamined, will never let you find it. Habit 3. Consuming without creating. This habit has never been easier to maintain, and it has never been better disguised. Because consumption in the modern world doesn't look like laziness. It looks like staying informed. It looks like research. It looks like engagement with ideas, with culture, with the work of people you admire. You are watching, reading, listening, absorbing. You are, by any reasonable measure, doing something. But there is a difference between doing something and building something. And that difference, quiet, uncomfortable, easy to avoid examining, is where this habit lives. Seneca wrote about this with a sharpness that still lands. He observed that the mind, which is always receiving and never producing, becomes a kind of storage room, full of other people's thoughts, other people's frameworks, other people's conclusions, with no space left for its own. Not because the input isn't valuable, but because input without output is not learning. It is accumulation. And accumulation, mistaken for growth, is one of the quietest ways a capable mind stays permanently below its own potential. You probably know the feeling. So the hours spent consuming content about the thing you want to build, rather than building it. The books read about the life you want to live, rather than living it. The endless research into the project that has not yet begun, because beginning requires something that consumption never asks of you. It requires exposure. the risk of making something that can be seen, assessed, found wanting. The vulnerability of putting your actual effort into the world and discovering what it is worth. Consumption eliminates that risk entirely. You can spend years in a state of genuine intellectual engagement, absorbing ideas, forming opinions, developing taste, and produce nothing. And the tragedy of this is not that the consumption was worthless. Most of it wasn't. The tragedy is that the capacity that was meant to produce something remained permanently in preparation. Permanently almost ready. Permanently one more book, one more video, one more piece of research away from the moment it would finally begin. That moment never comes on its own. Marcus Aurelius understood the relationship between thought and action with a precision that the Meditations makes visible on almost every page. He did not write to accumulate insights. He wrote to convert insights into conduct. Every observation he made about his own nature, every principle he restated and examined, was in service of one question. What do I actually do with this? Not, what do I now know? But how does this change what I build? That question is the one consumption never asks, because consumption is comfortable in a way that creation is not. Consumption keeps you in the audience, and the audience is a safe place. You can form opinions about the performance without being responsible for it. You can identify what is missing in other people's work without being accountable for your own. You can develop an increasingly sophisticated sense of quality while producing nothing that your own sense of quality can judge. That sophistication without output is not wisdom. It is a defense, a way of remaining in permanent preparation for a contribution that never arrives, protected from the judgment that creation invites, sustained by the feeling of engagement that consumption reliably provides. The Stoics were clear about what a life is for, not for watching, not for absorbing, for doing, for making something of the specific capacities you were given, in the specific time available to you, regardless of whether what you make is received the way you hoped. Self-respect, for the Stoics, was not a feeling. It was a product, the residue of having used your capacities fully rather than held them safely in reserve. Consumption cannot produce it. Only creation can. And the habit of consuming without creating will keep you indefinitely on the wrong side of that distinction. Habit 4. Avoiding discomfort disguised as self-care. This one requires the most care to name correctly, because unlike the habits that came before it, this one isn't entirely wrong. Rest is necessary. Recovery is real. The body and mind that never stop have limits, and ignoring those limits is its own kind of destruction. There is nothing in Stoic philosophy that asks you to run yourself into the ground in the name of virtue. But that is not what this habit is. This habit is something more subtle and considerably more costly. It is the use of self-care language to justify the avoidance of things that are difficult, but necessary. The reframing of strategic retreat as wisdom, the decision to protect your comfort by dressing it in the vocabulary of well-being, and then believing the dressing. You know the version of this that lives in your own life, the project that needs to be started, but not today, because today you need to rest. The conversation that needs to be had, but not yet, because you need to be in the right headspace first. The effort that needs to be made, but not right now, because you've been depleted and you owe it to yourself to recover before you push again. All of these statements can be true. Sometimes they are true. But the habit doesn't live in the true cases. It lives in the pattern. The pattern of reaching for recovery language every time something difficult approaches. The pattern of the threshold of discomfort and the retreat that follows it, dressed in the language of self-compassion. The pattern that, examined honestly, reveals not a person who is carefully managing their energy, but a person who has found a socially acceptable, internally convincing way to avoid the things that scare them. Marcus Aurelius practiced voluntary discomfort with a consistency that the Meditations makes clear was deliberate. Cold, simple food, the removal of unnecessary comfort, not because suffering was virtuous in itself. The Stoics were never ascetics for its own sake, but because he understood something precise about the relationship between comfort and capacity. A life arranged around the avoidance of difficulty is a life that shrinks by degrees, not dramatically, quietly. Each retreat making the next threshold slightly lower, each avoidance making the next discomfort slightly more overwhelming, until the range of things you are willing to face has contracted to the point where almost nothing difficult feels approachable. That contraction is invisible while it is happening. It doesn't feel like shrinking. It feels like knowing yourself. It feels like having learned, through experience, what you can and cannot handle. But what you are actually learning in those moments of retreat is not your limits. You are installing them. You are teaching your nervous system, repetition by repetition. The discomfort is a signal to withdraw rather than a condition to move through. And the self-care framing makes it worse, not better, because it adds a layer of self-approval to the avoidance. It converts the retreat into a virtue. It transforms the moment of withdrawal into evidence of wisdom, of self-knowledge, of emotional intelligence. And once avoidance has been reframed as wisdom, it becomes almost impossible to examine honestly. The Stoics made a distinction that modern self-care culture has largely collapsed. Between restoration, the genuine recovery that makes the next effort possible, and avoidance, the comfortable withdrawal that makes the next effort less likely. One replenishes capacity, the other reduces it. One is in service of the life you are building. The other is in service of the discomfort you are not yet willing to face. Rest when rest is genuinely needed. But learn to feel the difference between the tiredness that requires recovery and the resistance that requires movement. Between the depletion that asks for stillness and the fear that is asking for permission to stay exactly where it is. One is your body telling you the truth. The other is a habit dressed in your body's language. Habit 5. Overthinking as a substitute for action. Of all the habits on this list, this one has the most convincing disguise. Because overthinking doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like thoroughness. It feels like the responsible approach to decisions that actually matter. The careful consideration of consequences. The mapping of possibilities. The refusal to act rashly when the stakes are real. In a world that consistently punishes impulsiveness, a mind that thinks carefully before acting seems like exactly the right kind of mind to have. But there is a threshold. Beyond it, thinking stops being preparation and becomes something else. A way of remaining in motion without committing to a direction. A way of feeling productive while systematically avoiding the one action that would actually move something forward. A way of staying in the planning stage indefinitely, because the planning stage carries none of the risk that execution does. That threshold is where this habit lives. And most people who have this habit have never located the threshold, because from the inside, more thinking always feels like it might produce more clarity. One more consideration. So one more angle examined, one more potential consequence mapped. Surely, at some point, enough thinking will produce the certainty that makes action feel safe. It won't. Certainty is not the product of thinking. It is the product of action, of moving forward with incomplete information, learning what the thinking couldn't tell you, and adjusting from there. The certainty that overthinking is waiting to produce will never arrive, because it is not a destination that more thinking leads to. It is a feeling that only experience provides. Marcus Aurelius understood this with a clarity that runs through the entire architecture of the Meditations. He did not record his thinking so that he could think more. He recorded it so that he could act more precisely. Every observation, every principle, every examined belief was in service of conduct, of what he would actually do in the actual moment, with the actual circumstances in front of him. The thinking was a tool. Action was the point. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Most people read that as a statement about emotional control, but read it as a statement about overthinking, and it becomes something more precise. The mind that is running endless scenarios about outside events, that is rehearsing futures it cannot control, mapping consequences it cannot predict, seeking certainty in territory that was never going to provide it, has inverted the relationship. It has handed its power to the very thing it was told it cannot control. And in doing so, it has abandoned the only territory where power actually lives. Your thinking, your decision, are your next action. Right now, with the information you have. The habit of overthinking is not a sign of a careful mind. It is a sign of a mind that has confused the feeling of preparation with the fact of readiness. That has mistaken the activity of thinking for the progress of building. That has learned through years of reinforcement that staying in the planning stage is safer than entering the execution stage, and has therefore remained there indefinitely, accumulating more and more to think about and producing less and less of what it was capable of. The Stoics had one answer to this habit: not better thinking. Decision. The recognition that no amount of additional consideration is going to close the gap between where you are and where you need to be. That the next step forward does not require certainty. It requires commitment. And commitment is not something you think your way into. It is something you choose. And then you begin. If the first half of this is landing somewhere uncomfortable, if you're recognizing habits you've been carrying without naming them, stay with it. Subscribe, because what comes next goes deeper into the habits that operate closest to your identity. The ones that are hardest to see because they feel most like you. And if you know someone who is capable of more than their life currently reflects, send this to them, not as a critique, as a gift. Habit 6. Comparing your interior to others. Exterior. Every comparison you have ever made has been rigged against you. Not because you are less than the people you compare yourself to, but because of the information asymmetry that comparison always operates from, and that nobody ever names directly enough to make it stop. Here is what the comparison actually is. On one side, everything you know about yourself, the full interior, the doubts that arrive at 2 a.m., the gap between what you present and what you actually feel, the projects that stalled, the efforts that didn't land, the version of yourself that shows up in private when nobody is watching, when the performance isn't required. You have complete access to all of this. Every failure, every fear, every moment of uncertainty, all of it visible, all of it present, all of it part of the self you are measuring. On the other side, the surface of someone else's life, the output, not the process, the arrival, not the journey, the moments they chose to make visible, the work that landed, the opportunity that opened, the version of themselves they decided to present to the world. You have no access to their 2 a.m. No access to the projects that didn't make it. No access to the doubt, the fear, the private interior that looks, from where they stand, exactly as messy and uncertain as yours looks from where you stand. You are comparing your everything to their highlight, and then drawing conclusions about your relative worth from a comparison that was never honest enough to be meaningful. Seneca identified this distortion with a precision that cuts directly to its mechanism. He wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and comparison is imagination at its most systematically destructive. Because it doesn't just distort your perception of others, it distorts your perception of yourself. Every comparison that concludes in your disfavor installs a small piece of evidence that the gap between you and where you should be is larger than it actually is. And those pieces accumulate. Over time, they become a narrative. The narrative of someone who is perpetually behind, perpetually not quite enough, perpetually measuring themselves against a standard that exists nowhere in reality, assembled from the visible surfaces of other people's lives and treated as the baseline that a reasonable person should have already reached. That narrative is not an honest assessment of your situation. See, it is the residue of a habit that has been making dishonest comparisons for so long that the conclusions feel like facts. Marcus Aurelius returned to this in the Meditations from a position that should have made comparison irresistible. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he still had to remind himself repeatedly that his worth was not located in his position relative to others, that the quality of his life was determined by the quality of his inner life, not by how it compared to anyone else's, that the man who measures himself against others has outsourced his standard to a moving target that will never settle long enough to provide what he was looking for from it. What he was looking for was clarity, and clarity is not produced by comparison. It is destroyed by it, because comparison keeps your attention permanently on the wrong question. Not, am I living in alignment with my own values, building what I am capable of building, becoming who I am capable of becoming, but am I ahead of or behind someone else who is navigating their own entirely different life, with their own entirely different capacities, toward their own entirely different destination? That question has no useful answer, because it was never the right question. The Stoics had one standard that mattered, not better than yesterday's comparison, better than yesterday's version of yourself. That standard is the only one that is honest enough to be meaningful, because it is the only one that uses real information on both sides of the equation. So habit 7. Negative self-talk accepted as honesty. This habit has the most sophisticated defense of anything on this list, because the person who has it doesn't think of themselves as someone who talks to themselves negatively. They think of themselves as someone who is honest, someone who doesn't sugarcoat, someone who sees themselves clearly without the self-deception that they have watched other people use to excuse mediocrity and avoid accountability. The internal voice that says you're not ready, not good enough, not as far along as you should be by now. That voice doesn't present itself as cruelty. It presents itself as accuracy. And that rebranding is what makes it so difficult to examine. Because to challenge it feels like the first step toward the self-deception you've spent years trying to avoid. To question whether the internal narrative is true feels like the beginning of making excuses. So it goes unchallenged. It continues, and it shapes, quietly, consistently, with enormous precision, every decision you make about what you are capable of, what you deserve to attempt, and how far you are permitted to go. The Stoics made a distinction that this habit consistently erases between honest assessment and habitual diminishment, between the internal voice that evaluates clearly, that looks at a piece of work and identifies precisely where it falls short, that examines a decision and names exactly what went wrong, and the internal voice that defaults, regardless of evidence, to the conclusion that you are not enough. One is useful. One is a habit wearing the mask of usefulness. Marcus Aurelius understood the quality of the inner conversation as the foundation of everything else. He wrote about it, not as a peripheral concern, but as the central one, the place where all conduct originates, where all character is formed, where the quality of a life is determined before any external event has had a chance to shape it. The man who speaks to himself with contempt produces contemptible decisions. not because contempt is demoralizing in a vague sense, but because the inner voice is the filter through which every opportunity, every challenge, every possibility passes before it reaches the level of action. A filter set to diminishment will diminish everything that passes through it. Think about what this means in practice. The opportunity that appeared and was dismissed before it was seriously considered, because the internal voice had already assessed the outcome as unlikely, the attempt as probably futile, the effort as probably not worth the exposure. The creative work that never reached its potential, not because the capacity wasn't there, but because the inner narrator was simultaneously producing a running commentary about its inadequacy. The relationship that was entered with one foot already out the door, because somewhere beneath the surface, the voice that is supposed to be honest had already concluded that the good outcome wasn't really available to someone like you. That voice is not honesty. It is a habit, a pattern of internal narration that was installed, gradually, through accumulated experiences of falling short, through moments where the gap between your intention and your execution was real, and the internal response was to generalize from those specific failures to a broader conclusion about your fundamental adequacy. The specific failures were real, the generalization was not. And the habit of treating the generalization as honesty, of mistaking a chronic narrative for an accurate assessment, is what keeps it in place. Because it never gets examined. Because examination feels like denial. Because the voice has done such a thorough job of presenting itself as the one reliable narrator in a world full of self-deception that questioning it feels like the most dangerous thing you could do. Epictetus was direct about this. He said, "It is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about events." And the judgment that this habit produces, the judgment that you are fundamentally not enough, is not a conclusion drawn from the evidence. It is a habit of mind that precedes the evidence and shapes how the evidence is interpreted. Change the judgment and the evidence looks different, not because the facts have changed, but because the filter through which the facts are passing has been adjusted, from one that defaults to diminishment to one that defaults to honest, precise, specific assessment. That adjustment is not self-deception. It is the most honest thing you can do. Because the voice that has been calling itself honest has not been telling you the truth. It has been telling you a story. And it is time to examine whether that story is worth continuing to believe. Well, habit 8. Ignoring the present by living in the future. There is a version of your life that exists only in the future. It is the version where the important work has been started, where the difficult conversation has been had, where the goal has been reached and the anxiety that surrounds it has finally resolved. Where you are, at last, the person you have been meaning to become, and the life you have been meaning to live has finally begun in earnest. You return to that version often, not as a fantasy exactly, as a destination, a place you are moving toward, planning for, arranging the present in service of. And that orientation feels responsible. It feels like the right relationship with ambition. It feels like exactly the kind of forward thinking that distinguishes the people who build something from the people who don't. But there is something that this orientation quietly takes from you, the only place where your life is actually happening. Seneca wrote about this with an urgency that 2,000 years have done nothing to diminish. He observed that we are always preparing to live, but never actually living. Always arranging the conditions under which life will finally begin. When this is resolved, when that arrives, when the circumstances align in the specific way that will finally make the present moment worth fully inhabiting. And while the arranging is happening, while the preparation is ongoing, the present moves through and becomes the past. Not the future past, the actual past. The days that are gone now, and the hours that were spent in anticipation of a moment that either never arrived or arrived and was immediately replaced by the next future to anticipate. The conversations that happened at partial attention because the mind was already somewhere else. The work that was done adequately rather than fully, because full presence felt like a luxury that could be afforded later, when things had settled, when the conditions were finally right. The conditions are never finally right. That is not a pessimistic observation. It is a precise one. The future that you are waiting to inhabit fully will, when it arrives, contain its own set of conditions that are not yet right, its own next thing to resolve before presence becomes possible, its own reasons why now is not quite the moment, and later will be better. This is the structure of the habit. Not a single act of postponement, but a perpetual orientation. A way of relating to time that keeps the present permanently provisional. Permanently almost the moment, but not quite yet. Marcus Aurelius returned to the present with a deliberateness that the Meditations makes visible on almost every page. Not as a spiritual practice, as a philosophical discipline. The present moment was, for him, the only location where anything could actually be done. Not the future, which had not yet arrived and could not be acted in. Not the past, which had already closed and could not be changed. The present. This. Now. The only moment that was actually available, and therefore the only moment worth directing full attention toward. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not as an instruction to stop planning, not as a dismissal of the future as irrelevant, as a recognition that presence is where power lives, and that a mind perpetually displaced into a future that hasn't arrived yet is a mind that is not available for the life that is actually happening." Think about what has already been lost to this habit. The conversations that deserved your full attention, but received a fraction of it. The work that deserved your complete presence, but got the version of you that was partly somewhere else. The ordinary moments, the ones that don't announce their significance in advance, that passed without being fully inhabited and will not return. None of this was dramatic loss. It was incremental, a fraction of presence withheld here, a portion of attention diverted there, accumulated across months and years until the habit of partial inhabitation has become so familiar that full presence, when it occasionally arrives, feels almost unusual, almost like something that has to be earned before it is permitted. It doesn't. The present doesn't require your circumstances to be resolved before it deserves your full attention. It doesn't require the future to be secured before it is worth inhabiting completely. It is the only location where your life exists, and the habit of living elsewhere is the habit of not quite living at all. Habit 9. Letting resentment occupy space. This one is different from everything that came before it, because every habit on this list so far has been one you could, in honest moments, recognize as something that belongs to you, something generated from inside. Busyness, approval-seeking, overthinking. These are habits of your own making, running in your own mind, producing their own consequences in your own life. You can take ownership of them because they originate with you. Resentment feels different. Because resentment has an object, it points at something real, a person who acted without integrity, a situation that was genuinely unfair, a wrong that happened and deserved not to happen. The grievance that resentment is built around is not imagined. It is not a distortion. It is the accurate record of something that should have been different and wasn't. And that accuracy is exactly what makes this habit so difficult to release, because releasing it feels like revising the record, like agreeing retroactively that what happened was acceptable, like extending a forgiveness that hasn't been earned and a grace that wasn't deserved. The resentment feels like the appropriate response to a real wrong, and letting it go feels like a betrayal of the reality of that wrong. But the Stoics made a distinction here that changes everything, between the wrong that happened and the resentment that followed it, between the event, which is finished, and the response to the event, which is ongoing, between what was done to you, which is in the past and cannot be changed, and what you are doing to yourself, which is happening right now and is entirely within your control. Marcus Aurelius was direct about this. He didn't ask you to pretend the wrong didn't happen. He didn't offer the comfortable advice that everything happens for a reason, or that the people who harmed you meant well. He asked something more precise and considerably more difficult. He asked, who is being harmed by the resentment you are carrying right now? Not the person who caused it. You. Every moment that resentment occupies in your mind is a moment of your own mental space being used against your own life. Every return to the grievance, the replaying of what was said, what was done, how it should have gone, is an act of voluntary re-injury. You are returning, by choice, to the scene of a wound that would otherwise have begun to close. You are keeping it open, not because it serves the wound, but because the part of you that is holding the resentment has not yet found a way to lay it down without feeling like it is surrendering something important. What it is actually surrendering is nothing important at all. The resentment has not been punishing the person who caused it. It has not been correcting the injustice. It has not been producing anything that resembles justice, accountability, or repair. It has been occupying space, your space, that was needed for something else. For the work that requires your full attention. For the relationships that deserve your genuine presence. For the version of your life that cannot be built, while a significant portion of your internal resources are allocated to a grievance that has already closed. Epictetus understood this from a position that made resentment almost irresistible. He was enslaved. The wrong done to him was not subtle, not ambiguous, not a matter of interpretation. It was total. And yet the philosophy he built from that position was not organized around the injustice of his circumstances. It was organized around the one thing that the injustice could not reach, his own response to it, his own judgment, his own inner life, the territory that remained his regardless of what was done to the rest. Not because the wrong wasn't real, because the resentment would have handed over the one thing that hadn't been taken. That is the cost of this habit, not the dramatic cost, the quiet, accumulative one. The slow transfer of your mental and emotional resources from the life you are building to the grievance you are maintaining. The way resentment, held long enough, begins to shape not just how you feel about the specific wrong, but how you move through everything. How it makes you smaller, more defended, less available to the present. Because a portion of you is always back there, in the moment where the wrong happened. Running the scenario again. That portion of you is needed here, in this moment, in the life that is actually available, in the work that is waiting. The wrong happened. That is finished. What you do with the resentment is not. Habit 10. Waiting to be ready. Every habit on this list has been building toward this one, not separately, together, as a system. Each habit feeding the next, each one quietly contributing to the same final state. A person who is capable of more than their life currently reflects, who knows it, and who has been waiting, in one form or another, for the moment when they will finally feel ready to close the gap. That moment keeps not arriving. And it keeps not arriving for reasons that are now visible in a way they probably weren't at the beginning of this video. The busyness kept you moving without arriving, which meant the readiness that arrives from genuine progress was perpetually deferred. Approval-seeking kept your direction in other people's hands, which meant you could never be ready, because ready required a consensus that was never going to form. Consuming without creating kept you in permanent preparation, which is where readiness goes to live forever without ever being tested. Avoiding discomfort in the name of self-care kept the threshold of what felt approachable gradually lowering, until readiness required conditions that kept becoming slightly more demanding. Overthinking kept you in the planning stage indefinitely, because the certainty that overthinking was waiting to produce is the same certainty that readiness was waiting for. So comparing your interior to others. Exterior kept you measuring yourself against a standard that nobody has ever actually met, which made readiness a destination that kept moving. Negative self-talk accepted as honesty kept installing evidence that you were not yet enough, which is the same evidence that waiting to be ready runs on. Living in the future kept you permanently almost there, which is the same place that readiness lives. And resentment kept a portion of you anchored in the past, unavailable for the present, where readiness, if it exists at all, would have to be found. All 9 habits are, at their root, the same habit. The habit of not yet. The habit of a self that is perpetually in preparation for a life it has not quite begun. That is always one condition away from starting. That is serious about its intentions and consistent about its deferral. That has accumulated over years an enormous amount of evidence that it intends to begin, and an equally enormous gap between that intention and the life it has actually built. Marcus Aurelius had no patience for this, not because he was unsympathetic to the difficulty of beginning. He understood, better than most, how many forces conspire to keep a person in the preparation stage. But he understood something more important. That readiness is not a state you arrive at. It is not a threshold you cross, a feeling you achieve, a level of confidence you accumulate until it tips over into action. It is a decision that is available right now, with exactly the preparation you currently have, in exactly the circumstances you are currently in, with exactly the version of yourself that showed up today. Incomplete, uncertain, not yet who you intend to become, but already capable of the next step. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. That sentence is not a call to perfection. It is a call to decision. Stop deliberating about the version of yourself you will become when conditions are right. Become the version that acts now, with what is available now, toward what matters now. Because the conditions will not become right. The readiness will not arrive. The version of you that is finally prepared enough will not appear. What will appear, what always appears, is today. And today contains everything that is actually needed. Not certainty, not perfect preparation, not the absence of doubt or fear or the quiet voice that says you are not quite ready yet. It contains the next action, the next step, the specific, concrete, undramatic thing that the person you intend to become would do today. Not eventually, not when things have aligned, but now. Feel what this means against everything that came before it. The work that has been waiting to begin. The conversation that has been waiting to happen. The version of your life that has been assembled in detail in your mind and deferred in equal detail in your actions. None of it was waiting for better circumstances. None of it was waiting for you to become someone else. It was waiting for the decision that this habit has been perpetually postponing. That decision is available today. Not because everything is ready, because nothing ever is. And the life that waits for readiness is the life that waits forever. The Stoics didn't wait. They decided. And in that decision, made imperfectly, with incomplete information, in circumstances that were never fully right, they built something that has outlasted every obstacle that was supposed to stop them. You can do the same. Not when you're ready. Now, you came into this video looking for the habits, and you found them. 10 of them, each one ordinary enough to have been invisible, each one reasonable enough to have gone unchallenged, each one quietly contributing to a gap that you have probably been trying to close from the wrong direction. But here is what the list was really showing you. It wasn't 10 separate problems. It was one problem, wearing 10 different faces. The problem of a self that has been, in one form or another, waiting. Waiting to be ready. Waiting for conditions to improve. Waiting for the doubt to resolve and the fear to quiet, and the circumstances to align in the specific way that would finally make it feel safe to begin. The Stoics didn't offer comfort about this. They offered something more useful. Precision. Marcus Aurelius didn't write the Meditations to feel better about the habits he was carrying. He wrote them to see those habits clearly, without self-pity, without self-protection, without the softening that makes an honest diagnosis feel more bearable but less actionable. He wrote them because he understood that a life examined honestly, even when what the examination reveals is uncomfortable, is always more available for change than a life that remains unexamined. You have just examined 10 habits that most people carry their entire lives without naming. That examination changes something. So not because insight alone produces change. It doesn't. And the Stoics were clear about this. But because you cannot choose differently from a habit you cannot see. And what you have seen today, clearly, specifically, without the comfortable vagueness that lets destructive patterns continue without challenge, is the actual shape of what has been running. Now you can choose, not perfectly, not all at once, not in a single decision that resolves everything and launches the life you intended, but in the way that all real change happens, one ordinary moment at a time, in the daily practice of catching the habit before it runs, of choosing the direction rather than the default, of building, slowly, privately, without performance, the version of yourself that doesn't need to wait any longer. Seneca wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. The waste ends when the examination begins. You have begun. What comes next is not more examination. It is the work. The specific, unglamorous daily work of a person who has seen the habits clearly and decided, not eventually, not when ready, but now, in the next moment, in the next ordinary decision, in the quiet, private act of choosing differently than the habit would have chosen for you. That is not a dramatic transformation. It is something more durable than that. It is a life built deliberately, one decision at a time, by a person who stopped waiting and started building. The Stoics called that eudaimonia. Not happiness as a feeling, not success as an outcome, only flourishing, the experience of living fully as the person you chose to be in whatever circumstances arrive, with whatever readiness you currently have. It was always available. You were just waiting to begin. The building doesn't stop when the video does. What you've started here continues, and your next step is already waiting on your screen.